Professor David Kraemer. Dr. Kraemer, well, in addition to being a teacher both of Rabbi Markowitz and myself, and also Rabbi Rosen, Dr. Kraemer has been part of the JTS community since 1977, when he enrolled at the graduate school after completing his undergraduate degree at Brandeis University. He began teaching as a graduate student in 1980, receiving his PhD in 84. Dr. Kraemer's focus as a professor is on the literary analysis of rabbinic literature, rabbinic ritual, and the social and religious history of Jews in late antiquity. He accepted the position of librarian in 2004 and has since played a crucial role in forging policy and expanding the impact of the library's world-renowned collections and programs. Dr. Kraemer is a prolific author and commentator. In addition to books on the history of the Talmud, Rabbinic Judaism, Space and Place, Jewish Eating and Identity, The Meanings of Death in Rabbinic Judaism, which in this crowd I have quoted many, many times, Reading the Rabbis, the Talmud as Literature. I could continue on here, but really in incredible amount of works that take the Talmudic language and try to give us a sense of what is the mind and the reality of life in that time that would give rise to such wisdom. In addition to these books, he's written influential articles on the biblical books of Ezra and Nehemiah, on the Mishnah, and other subjects, along with a commentary on Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And in all of these, I would say that I am so thrilled to share one of my teachers with you, because the idea which animates my imagination whenever I'm studying text is what was the culture, the mindset, the society, the givens, the assumptions that would give rise, as I said, to such wisdom and such inspiration, that we continue to draw inspiration from this ancient wisdom. And Dr. Kraemer, that is something that every time I have had the opportunity to learn with you, I'm only reminded of how important that is, and how foundational it is to our understanding of the religion that we practice now. And so I'm now going to stop talking, and I'm going to hope that you will share just, and know that you will share just a bit of that wisdom that you shared with myself and my colleagues at JTS so many times now, actually many years ago. So take care.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. You didn't need to, go down the lists, but okay, whatever, We've got, at this point, a little bit less than an hour is my understanding, right? So we'll use it to its maximum effect. It's a pleasure to see all of you. One of the things I have to say as a teacher is, the joy of teaching is having interchange, talking about an issue, arguing about an opinion, interpreting and sharing opinions, and so forth. And so this medium, Zoom or its equivalents, while it is wonderful in that it allows us the possibility of gathering from far and wide, and that's definitely a benefit. At the same time, it's much harder to carry on a conversation this way. So I will be making a presentation that I hope will both fascinate and interest you. But I also want to encourage you to ask questions. I assume that you can unmute yourselves when you want to ask questions. I don't know if this doesn't always work, but presumably if you hold down your space bar, right? If you press your space bar and hold it down, you will be unmuted as long as you are holding the space bar. And then when you let it go, you'll be back on mute. So that's an easy way to be able to speak up and ask a question and then automatically go back to mute, which is good because then we don't hear the background noises. But in any case, I do encourage you to ask questions. I am going to share a screen, so I won't be able to see all of you at the same time. What that means is if you want to ask a question, just unmute yourself. We're not so large a crowd. And if we respect one another, it'll be easy to respond to what you have to say, okay? So those are the only ground rules that I want to lay out. Let me explain what I'm going to share with you both tonight, and I think we're meeting in another 2 weeks. Isn't that right? Okay. So I am, as you just heard, the librarian at the um, Jewish Theological Seminary, the director of the library, that is. And you may or may not know that the library of the Jewish Theological Seminary is one of the greatest collections of Judaica, and particularly rare Judaica, in the entire world. It is not an exaggeration to say that there is not a single collection anywhere on earth that exceeds our rare collection in its depth, in its quality. What that means is that we have been an essential resource for scholars, of course, over the course of years, but not only for scholars. If people want to learn about Judaism or about the peoples amongst whom Jews have lived, and of course, Jews have lived amongst all kinds of peoples throughout the ages, one of the essential places to do in-depth research or just to find something beautiful or fantastic is at the library of JTS. So I've been doing this now for, say, 16 years. I've been, as you heard, at JTS for much longer, as a student, as a professor of Talmud and rabbinics. But my greatest joy has been to work with this collection and to learn about it. And what I'd like to do is share with you a carefully curated selection of materials, of images, mostly but not exclusively from our collection, to talk about the question of acculturation, because there's a lot of evidence for Jewish acculturation in these materials. You don't need to know how to read Hebrew in order to see this. You don't need to know how to translate Hebrew in order to make these interpretations. The most beautiful thing about manuscripts, unlike most printed books, printed books give you, the official version of, say, the Hebrew Bible text or something. But there's nothing interesting in the margins unless somebody's been taking notes in them and they happen to be an interesting person. What's amazing about the manuscripts is that in addition to the text, there's always the margins, there's the decorations, there's the painting, the beauty, the illumination, and there's always something to find there. The other thing that needs to be said is that when we're dealing with manuscripts, and I'm going to be showing you overwhelmingly manuscripts of the material from the library, unlike printed books, manuscripts can be very diverse, and they don't require careful control. Printing is an interesting and, for its history, problematic venture, problematic technology, because you can print hundreds and thousands of copies of a work at the same time, which means from the perspective of the authorities, printed books can be dangerous. And so there's often been censorship. And from the perspective of the printers, there've got to be enough people who will buy this to make it worth printing it. The same is not true with manuscripts, which means that manuscripts can be far more individualized and they preserve surprises. And I'm not exaggerating. They preserve surprises that are really worth diving into. So what we're going to do tonight is to venture into the evidence regarding acculturation of Jews in both the lands of Islam and in Ashkenaz, in medieval Ashkenaz, that is to say, medieval Northern Europe. And in the next session, if you choose to come back, we're going to, as they say, do a deep dive into materials representing Jewish acculturation in Renaissance Italy, which is absolutely beautiful and fascinating, because Jewish life, like all life in Renaissance Italy, had very special qualities. Okay, so that's the background. Unless I see someone shaking your hand or speaking up, really, excitedly, I'm going to assume that that lays the foundation. Anyone have something you need to ask before we begin? Okay, I am going to share my screen then. And here we go. I'm going to see if I can now expand the screen. I always hate this manipulation of screens. So here, let me see if it will allow me here. Play from start. Okay, can you see the Expanded, okay, looks good. Excellent, okay. So I'm beginning with a very ugly but very famous piece here. So let me step back and give you a little bit of background um, before I speak about what's on the screen in front of you. One of the most important parts of the JTS Library's collection is something called the Cairo Geniza. Since I can't see many of you, I'm not going to ask, has anyone ever heard of the Cairo Geniza? I'm sure that some have. I'm not going to ask anyone to define it because, you know, again, I can't see if you raise your hand. The Cairo Geniza is a collection of the discarded written materials of the community, the Jewish community in Cairo for 1,000 years, believe it or not, from the 9th century all the way till its discovery by Europeans in the 19th century. It was a massive collection, a Geniza ordinarily. And Rabbi Yanov, I assume you've got a Geniza at your synagogue there, yes?
We do.
Yes. Okay, good. So ordinarily, right, tell me if I'm wrong, right? A Geniza is a place where you put out worn out prayer books and things like that, and they will be buried at some point, right? In order not to desecrate them. Am I right?
Every 3 to 4 years, we load it up.
Okay, good. But it's mostly worn out like prayer books and the like, right? Well, Cairo is different, and it was different in really important ways. First of all, for reasons we don't know, no one ever sent the materials in the Geniza of the synagogue in Old Cairo for burial, which means that it collected materials generation after generation, century after century. And the other unique thing about this collection, the Cairo Geniza, is that the community seems to have felt that what we call Hebrew letters, right? Simply the letters with which we write the Hebrew language, but other languages can be written in it too, were sufficiently sacred that anything written using this script can be, or should be, excuse me, should be thrown into the Geniza. Now, let me ask you a question, and here, just speak up, unmute yourself if you've got a response. What language did Jews living in Cairo speak?
Arabic.
Arabic, absolutely right, because in most times and places, Jews have spoken the language of their neighbors. They spoke Arabic. How did they write their Arabic?
In Hebrew letters.
Correct, using what we call Hebrew letters. That's exactly right. I'm being a little bit pedantic here, so let me apologize for that. I keep on saying what we call Hebrew letters. The reason for that is because what we call Hebrew letters were originally Aramaic letters, but okay, from now on, I'll just call them Hebrew letters. So the writing that they knew was what is Hebrew, and they wrote their spoken language using Hebrew letters, which means that not only did sacred things get thrown into the Geniza, like prayer books, like pieces of, you know, books from the Tanakh, Torah scrolls and so forth, but even private letters, even bills from a shop, even contracts. This is the most abundant source we have. It is, in fact, the most abundant source anywhere for the study of any history. I mean, this is literally the largest source of original materials to be found anywhere in the world. And we at JTS have the second largest collection of these materials. Solomon Schechter was the one who gathered most of the materials, and he was at the time teaching at Cambridge, University of Cambridge in England. There was someone who got there before Schechter, who took about 43,000 fragments from the Cairo Geniza, and they came into our collection later on. So what you see in front of you is one of those examples. What you can see here is a handwritten letter. Handwritten is redundant because there was no other way to produce materials in those days. If you look carefully, you can see it's actually not in bad shape. You see the lines that go across it from right to left or left to right? Those are folds. And this was very typical of letters. A letter would be written and then it would be rolled over into a kind of scroll. And they didn't have envelopes. What they would do is seal it with a wax seal. And the way you knew that nobody had tampered with it was that the seal was still present. You would remove the seal and then you would unfold it. Now, those of you who can read a little bit of Hebrew, if you look at the last written line, the first word is somewhat erased. So you're not going to be able to make that out. But if you go into the middle of the line, you've actually got some pretty good squarely written Hebrew letters. Just to help you out, to focus on this, the first two letters are bet and resh, as in bar, like bar mitzvah. Can anybody read what comes right after the word bar?
Maimon?
That's exactly right. Who is that? Hannah?
Yes.
Okay, Hannah, you did an excellent job. And who is Bar Maimoni or Bar Maimon?
Moshe ben Maimon,
That's
Maimonides.
the one, Maimonides. Maimonides. So what you've got in front of you is a letter that was signed by Maimonides, who was either 30 or 33 at the time this letter was written and he signed it. He was already recognized internationally as a scholar of major proportions. And when he came from Spain to Cairo, right, which he did in his mid to late 20s, he was immediately appointed head of the community. And so when the community had official business to do, Maimonides would be involved with that. What you've got here is a letter written by a scribe. Maimonides didn't write the letter, he only signed it, in Judeo-Arabic, which will be the reason that even if you can read some of the letters, unless you know Judeo-Arabic, you will not be able to make probably any of it out, right? Yeah, even if you read Hebrew well, you wouldn't be able to make sense of this because the language is Arabic, which is the way Jews communicated with Jews. The letter is a letter that was written during the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. Right? Maimonides lived in Egypt at the same time as the Crusaders created a kingdom in Palestine, and they had taken Jewish captives. And one of the greatest mitzvahs for Jews is to redeem captives. And so Maimonides, with other officials in the community, went to raise money. And in this letter, he says, to the local communities, to members of the local communities, please pay up your pledges because we want to be able to redeem these captives. Now, you might be able to make out something really important in this letter. In addition to Maimonides' name, if you count up from the bottom, you'll see in the first word of the line, right, beginning with the second letter, right? It might be a little bit hard to read. There's an aleph, then a lamed, and then a lamed, and then a hey, right? Aleph, lamed, lamed, hey. Can anyone pronounce that and make it out if you know how to read Hebrew?
Kala.
Allah, right? You're adding the first letter. The first letter is an Arabic prefix.
Okay.
But the word is Allah. We all know what the word Allah means. It's the Arabic for what?
God.
For God. Now we go up from there, 1, 2, 3 more lines. Can you find the name Allah written out again? Right? You see that? It's the third word in from the beginning of the line. So when a Jew living in Cairo, in an Arab land in the Middle Ages, right, speaking Arabic, wanted to say God, well, we in English say God, as I have to you. When they wanted to say God, how did they say God? Allah. Right? Allah wasn't the name of a special Muslim God. Allah was the general Arabic name for God, and is, by the way, to this day, even though we use it in the specific sense. And I point this out because Maimonides and his scribe and everyone who would have read this were so comfortable in Arabic language and Arabic culture that when they heard or used the word Allah, there was no Muslim implication to it whatsoever. It was a thoroughly familiar term that allowed them to participate in the religious culture of the community. Now, I'm going to give you another example here. So here we've got another letter from the Geniza. The writing is actually on the part of the author. Question, can you see the arrow of my cursor on the document? You can. Okay, great. So this is a very, very special letter. It's one of 4 examples we have in our collection of a letter actually written by the very prominent and famous medieval Jewish philosopher and poet. Some of you will know his name. His name was Judah Halevi, right? So this is a letter actually written by Judah Halevi in his own hands. He had a habit of writing, you can see here, at an angle, of wasting paper. But of course, paper was very valuable during this time, so you didn't waste paper. So when he finished writing down to the bottom line, he then filled it in by writing at an angle at the side. You may be able to make out here, right, where the cursor is. We've got the words. I don't read Judeo-Arabic well, but I've learned to identify this, right? The words, wait, where did my cursor go? There it is, right? Wa'al katab al kuzari. Okay, Judah Halevi is most famous for a single work of philosophy called the Kuzari. Here he's writing to his trading merchants. The way a philosopher and poet would make a living in the Middle Ages was by taking whatever little monies they made and investing them. And so he had an agent who would invest and trade on his behalf along the trade routes. And so he's writing to his trading agent and saying, I've just finished this little book, right, about the Kuzari, right? And I don't think very highly of it, but if you'd like, I'll send you a copy, is basically what we've got here. But again, if you read through the language, katab, some of you may recognize from the Hebrew kotev, right, which means to write. So we could translate it as a writing, but in Arabic, it's most often used to speak about a book. So again, what we see here is the thorough immersion of Jews in Arabic culture, and the evidence that we've got in our collection is abundant. Before I go on, does anybody have a question about what I've shown so far? We good? Okay, so now I'm going to take you out of the library in order for you to see how these writings reflect what we know on the ground as well. Because there are places, some very special places, where we can actually see Jews participating in Muslim culture in ways that are quite direct and obvious, and for those of us who aren't familiar with it, quite surprising. So here you've got one wall, it's actually where the Torah ark would have been, of what's called the Maimonides synagogue. It actually was built after Maimonides' lifetime. It's from the early 1300s, so it is a medieval synagogue in the town in which Maimonides grew up, which is Cordoba, Spain. And it still exists today. I mean, it's been restored, but it is very close to the original. And much of what you see here is actually simply restored original. When you look at this, what do you see? If I hadn't told you that this was the inside of a synagogue, what would you have identified it as being?
Inside of a mosque.
Yes, exactly right. And I'll show you parallels to that. Right? I mean, the decoration, the vocabulary of decoration, the cultural reference is all very obviously Muslim, and this would be a perfect reflection of the Muslim regime in Spain at the time. Another image from inside the same synagogue, and this is original, and you can see that despite the appearances, the inscription is quotation from traditional Hebrew sources. And so, we see Jews who are living their Jewish life while at the same time thoroughly at home in the Muslim cultural life. And this goes beyond small communities. So here we've been in Cordoba, which is in Al-Andalus, southern Spain, but we can even go up to, I shouldn't have jumped ahead so soon. These are latter-day statues. Does anybody recognize the statue at the right? It's actually rather famous in the Jewish community. Anybody know who that is?
Maimonides.
Yeah,
I think.
that's meant to be Maimonides, and it's based upon certain later drawings of Maimonides. The individual at the left is the Muslim philosopher Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes. Their lives overlapped with one another, which means that what Maimonides studied, Averroes studied, and vice versa. Right? They were both rationalist philosophers, whose first and most important source was Aristotle. But the municipality of Cordoba has done a beautiful job in creating these and making them look very much alike, right? The dress, the turban, and so forth. Because even if this is a retrospective imagination, and the Maimonides statue, at least, I don't know the timing of the origin of the Ibn Rushd statue, but the Maimonides statue was only erected in the 1960s. But it is nevertheless a very good symbol of the culture of the time and place when both of these individuals lived. Now here, we've gone up north to Toledo, right? Toledo is, you will recall, south of Madrid, a little bit west, but primarily south of Madrid. As you look at this, again, I'm about to ask a trick question. If you didn't know, if this wasn't part of the presentation I'm making now, you would look at this and say, it is what?
Mosque.
Yes, clearly a mosque. And this kind of arching with the pillars below it is quite common in mosques throughout Muslim Spain. In fact, the very large and beautiful mosque back down in Cordoba looks very much like this. This is much smaller than that mosque, but by appearance, it's very similar. This is actually the oldest surviving synagogue in Europe. It is probably from 1180. So, it's built by Jews who are living in Muslim Spain in Toledo during this period. It's before the Reconquest. So, still the central and northern parts of Spain remain in Muslim hands. They will soon fall to Christian hands, but the Muslim character of this is unmistakable. Just to give you another view of this, it's rather beautiful. For those of you who haven't taken the trip to Spain, I recommend it very, very highly. And again, an inscription in the same synagogue, which is, quotation of traditional Hebrew source. But again, they perceive their assimilation, right, or acculturation. If assimilation is a naughty word to you, then you might prefer the word acculturation. But their at-homeness in the local culture, they do not experience as being at all in conflict with with their Jewishness. So we saw this in the writings, and there's much more in the writings, but we see this also expressed on the ground. That is the end of our brief visit to Muslim materials. I can tell you that if, and I hope more correctly, when you come to the library of JTS after the pandemic and where we've restored to our new beautiful rare book room all of our materials, you'll come and visit us. We will be able to show you many, many more materials from Jews living in the Muslim world. Most of our most beautiful materials from Jews in the Muslim world are actually not from the Middle Ages, but from mid to late modernity, 18th, 19th century, some beautifully decorated, illuminated materials, including marriage contracts, ketubot. So there's much to see, and I invite you to come see it. So that's the Muslim world. We're about to jump to Northern Europe, but before we do that, are there any questions concerning what you just saw? You're shy folks, or I haven't said anything puzzling? What's the correct answer? You don't like speaking up on Zoom?
A brief question. This is during the period when Muslims and Jews were getting along very, very well.
Right, exactly.
By and large, yes, but it's important to add to that, listen, I mean, human experience, as we know today, is always complicated. And, times of harmony can quickly be followed by by times of enmity and even violence. So, there are people who argue about how golden was the golden age of Spain, but Maimonides and his family. Maimonides was born either in 1135 or 1138. There's a dispute about his birth date. But whichever it was, when he was in his teens, Cordoba was taken by a reactionary Muslim regime from North Africa. As I said, Cordoba is very much in the south. And to live as a Jew under this new regime was very difficult. And so Maimonides' family first escaped from Cordoba and remained in Spain, but then went actually to North Africa, which puzzles everybody because in effect what they did was they went to the belly of the beasts. The parallel would be, a Jewish family living in Austria who after the Anschluss decided to go make a home in Berlin, right? I mean, that's kind of what this signifies. And he lived there through his teens into his 20s. And people puzzle about this and wonder how could Maimonides and his family have survived as Jews under those circumstances? Did they live as hidden Jews? Did he perhaps convert outwardly to Islam? And there's some who believe that Maimonides actually did convert outwardly to Islam. But then in his latter 20s, he made his way to Cairo. And there he, of course, resumes his full public Jewish identity. But I use this story to respond to your question because the answer is there were times even throughout the following centuries when the experience of Jews was very, very good in Muslim Spain and other Muslim lands. In Egypt, during Maimonides' life as a Jew was very, very good. And there were other times that it was difficult. It's really impossible to either, give a period, a single characterization, or to create a narrative that goes in only one direction, right? It always goes in one direction and then another. Okay? Anybody else here on either the materials or the architecture?
I have a question.
Yes, please.
We seem surprised now to hear Jews refer to God as Allah, because now it just has a certain connotation. But
Right.
in that context, was using the word Allah like saying God? Like
Exactly.
So that's all it was.
That's all it was.
That's all it was.
That's all it was. But, right, I said it's an expression of the comfort of Jews in that culture. And that needs to be emphasized because when you look at Arabic sacred vocabulary, not the Arabic language, as either a conversational language or the like, but sacred vocabulary, the names of religious principles and institutions in Islam, many of them, not all of them, but many of them have got what we would recognize as cognate Arabic terms, which are cognate to the Hebrew. So for example, charity is sadaqah, right? Which we refer to as tzedakah. Paradise is, the Arabic equivalent of Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, and so forth. This is all over the place. And so when Jews heard Muslims expressing their religious beliefs and commitments, these actually were familiar and therefore created a sense of comfort or at-homeness for the Jews, who found a far more familiar context amongst Muslims than they did amongst Christians, right? Christian vocabulary, following Latin and the like, was far more foreign to Jews than was Arabic vocabulary. Okay, so I'm looking at my time and I want to go forward because we got some really interesting examples here. So we've now jumped to Northern Europe, and the first work, this is from our collection. The first work you see here is a beautiful, large volume, carefully written by a scribe, which was produced in the early 13th century, that is the early 1200s. It is the earliest, most complete, and therefore most important manuscript of a work called Machzor Vitry. Vitry is a small community not far from Paris. I mean, today it's in the suburbs of Paris, but then it was, not far from Paris. This represents the very first record we have of the rules and practices pertaining to the conduct of life as a Jew in Ashkenazi lands. It was written by an individual or individuals who were students of Rashi. Yeah, and I mean, the person to whom it's attributed actually, I mean, as a student, meaning literally a student, his life overlapped with Rashi. And as I say, this is a very important work. The manuscript is from about 100 years after the work was first composed. And those of you who have been looking carefully at the page will quickly notice that on the bottom left part of the page, there's what looks like a stamp or a little illustration. And if you look in on that, if you focus on it, what is it?
Fleur-de-lis.
Yeah, that is a fleur-de-lis. What's a fleur-de-lis?
Symbol of France.
Exactly, right? It is a symbol of France. It actually was used by a variety of royalties in Europe in the Middle Ages and even beyond, but it became in particular the symbol of the French royalty and then a general symbol of France. It began before this, but not all that long before this to be the dominant symbol. Why is there a fleur-de-lis just plopped on the margin of what is effectively a work of rabbinic law, right? Rabbinic law and custom. I'm not going to ask you to answer that question yet because there's more we've got to see before we can make sense of it. But it surely seems to be, something that doesn't have a place there. This is a later page in the same manuscript, and it's the place where the scribe decided to take a break and tell you who he was. And you can see if you read Hebrew, his name was Eliezer, that's clear on the top line. Bar, meaning Berebi, the son of Reb Shmu, and he couldn't finish the name there, so he goes on to the next line, Shmuel. So Eliezer, the son of Shmuel, Chazak v'nit Chazek. You'll notice that the letters are not written with solid ink. If you look carefully, this is what's called micrography. I'll come back to micrography in a moment, but it's letters formed with very small letters written to create the larger letters. The small letters are quotations of verses from the Hebrew Bible. It's actually not that part of it that I'm interested in for the moment. When you look below, you see a series of primitive drawings or illustrations. Somebody want to tell us what you see there?
Well, it looks like there's a guy blowing a trumpet.
Yes, so you've got a guy blowing a trumpet or a hunting horn. I think it's probably, more specifically identified because he's right below what?
It's right below the fellow who's on a horse. I thought he
Right,
was
wielding a sword, right? And who's the guy on the left? What's he doing?
He looks like he's about to slaughter this animal.
Right, which is a deer, a stag, right? Okay. So what you've got on the left here is a hunting scene, right? And what do we have on the right? It's somebody else?
Peacocks?
Yeah, they look like peacocks. I like to refer to them as lovebirds, right? Because whatever kind of bird they are, they're clearly involved in intimate contact. Why is this here on this page? What does it have to do with the law of what Jews do when they wake up in the morning, when they eat or don't, what they should eat or don't eat, the way they should recite their prayers, etc.? What does it have to do with any of that? What's the short answer?
They're doodles.
Yeah, well, it looks like a doodle. I'll say that it's more than a doodle, but what does it have to do with the content of the manuscript? The answer is nothing. Okay, so we'll come back to answer that in a moment. I've got for you a third page from the same manuscript, and here you'll see there is no illustration, there's no doodling, but there is something very important. So if you look at the right column, you'll see that there's very small writing at the top, followed by somewhat larger writing that went to the bottom of the right column and into the middle of the left. And then there's a later addition in a different darker ink that follows that. We can read the words here very easily. Just to give you the context, on the prior page, there's a description of how to observe a Jewish wedding. Okay, so it tells you how to write a ketubah, it tells you the 7 blessings that are supposed to be recited, and so forth. The little letters at the top here say that after you finish with, the marriage ceremony, you're supposed to have a festive meal. So basically what it says is make a festive meal and have fun, right? Those are the little letters at the top. And then what we've got below that is actually a wedding poem, or more likely a wedding song, but we don't know the tune, right? So it's the words of a song that was sung at Jewish weddings in France in the early 13th century, right? For some reason, the scribe thought it was a good idea to give you an example of one of these songs so you knew how to celebrate a wedding. So how does the poem go? I'm going to read it in the original. You may or may not be able to follow me here, but listen carefully and tell me what language or languages I am reading, okay? El Givat Halivona Notre Chosen it Arrive. Okay, again, El Givat Halivona Notre Chosen it Arrive. Anybody?
French.
Okay, so the first few words, the first three words on the first line are Hebrew,
Hebrew.
right? And the next words are medieval French. And then if we were to read through this, we would have another verse in Hebrew, another verse in French, Hebrew, French, all the way to the end of the poem. Okay, now I'm going to ask the question I asked before, but now in a different context. What language did Jews living in, say, Paris in the year 1300 speak?
French.
French, of course, because until we get to Yiddish in modernity, Jews always spoke the language of their neighbors. Okay, but here we see something even more interesting than that. So why is this Hebrew, French, Hebrew, French? If we translate this poem, we find that the French part of the poem is a romantic poem that speaks about love, right? Totally appropriate to the wedding eve. If we read the Hebrew, much of which is quotation from scripture, with a dirty mind, right? You would have to be a teenage boy to get it to completely, okay? But if you read the Hebrew part of the poem and understand its double entendre, suffice it to say that a sword is never merely a sword, right, in this poem, what you quickly realize is that it's a very bloody poem, right, which is about the sexual conquest of the bride on the evening of the wedding. Right? And it's very, very explicit. Trust me, you would blush if I read and explained it, right? So why do we have the Hebrew, French, Hebrew, French? A woman, a scholar who's worked on this, suggests quite convincingly in my mind that men were more likely to know a little bit of the Hebrew because they had access to education. Right? And so they might have known the meaning of the Hebrew, but women were far less likely to understand the Hebrew. And so the men could kind of wink at each other while reciting, the Hebrew, which, as I said, right, was very filthy in its way. And then they would speak romantic poetry for the women, the Jewish women, who understood only the French. This entire manuscript is a testimony to the Frenchness of French Jews in the Middle Ages. The fleur-de-lis does that. The hunting scenes do that. I mean, that simply is the experience or representation of life in the French countryside during this period, and the poem shows it as well. These are Jews, to be sure, but they are Jews who are as much French as they are anything else. So that's the first piece I've got for you from our library from Ashkenaz. Here I want to just look very, very briefly in order to take advantage of the micrography we saw before. You can see this is marked for you as a micrographic Bible. It's from roughly 1300, so the same period, right, from what we today call Germany, but it was part of the same Ashkenaz. And you see here the first page of the book of Job in this biblical manuscript. What I draw your attention to is the decoration around the first word at the top. And if you look carefully at the decoration, you'll see the same phenomenon we saw before, which is that this is actually written out of microscopic, very, very small Hebrew letters. Every piece of that decoration is that, which is used to decorate this beautiful manuscript. Interestingly, and I'll refer back to this in a moment, Micrography was the only native Jewish art form that Jews used during the Middle Ages, right? Every other art form you see Jews using was borrowed from their neighbors. And they did this gladly and to enrich Jewish culture. Yes, I have just said Jews in the Middle Ages enriched their culture through conscious borrowing of what they saw amongst their neighbors. So let's go on here. We're in roughly the same period, still in the territory we call Germany. Esslingen is not far from Frankfurt. You know, that area of Germany. I mean, it was in its time a prosperous trading town in the Middle Ages. And you can see this is called a Machzor. Machzor for us means high holiday prayer book. Machzor in the Middle Ages actually meant any kind of cycle of prayers. In this case, the manuscript, which is huge, absolutely the heaviest book I have ever picked up, written on very thick and beautiful parchment. It includes the prayers for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and the holiday of Sukkot. So it was a machzor for the fall holidays. You can imagine this manuscript open on the reader's stand in the middle of the small Ashkenazi synagogue in a place like Esslingen. And even if you don't have a prayer book, and remember, most people would not have prayer books because there was no printed prayer book. You would have had to be wealthy enough to afford to have to hire someone to write the prayer book for you. So most people in a synagogue simply listened to what the cantor was reciting, and they could see the book he was using. This would have been the cantor's book. What's the word in the middle of the page? Yeah, I see Marilyn, you're saying without unmuting, Melech, right, which means king. You could have been in the highest reaches of the women's gallery and you would have seen that word. That's how large it is, right? So this is kind of an audio-visual signal from the scribe. What do we see around the word Melech?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a palace, right? A castle, exactly right. And so here we've got the decoration reinforcing the message of the word, each of them working with the other. It's very interesting to see the influence of what appears to us. I mean, look at the way the arches are designed. It looks like the synagogue we saw in Toledo, right? We don't know why, but there is clearly some kind of what we would call Moorish influence here. Another page here in this same manuscript. Many of you, I'm sure, will be able to read this. What does it say?
Kol Nidre.
Kol Nidre, the beginning of the Yom Kippur service. And again, look how largely this is written. This is to signal everybody there, you know, that something really important is about to begin. But now look at this page, right? I could give you many examples of this, but look at this page. So this is one of the liturgical poems, the Piyutim, from the high holidays, Imru Elohim. But throughout the page, in addition to the Hebrew words, what else do you see? You see decorations that take the form of what?
They look like little beasts.
They are beasts, and in fact, they are more specifically dragons. And you find dragons on many, many pages of this manuscript. You'll even notice how at the top, the page was cut off by a later owner or somebody. There was originally a dragon that went all the way up to the top of the page, whose head is half cut off, but it's an extension of the letter Lamed, right? You've got Imru Elohim, and the Lamed rests on the top of the olive, and it kind of rose up into a dragon. Why are there dragons in a high holiday prayer book? In Germany in 1290. Why are there dragons? Right? I can give you a hint. It's not because the artist was watching Game of Thrones. Okay, so why is it? The answer is because if you lived in the Gothic Middle Ages, right, your imagination would have led you to dragons everywhere, whether you were in Germany, whether you were in Spain. Dragons were amongst the most common decorations we see here. And a dragon in a high holiday prayer book is not because it's a Jewish symbol. A dragon is never a Jewish symbol. It's because it's a common symbol. And once again, we see an example here of Jews thoroughly immersed in Jewish piety, who nevertheless signal their at-homeness in the local culture. This I mean, as I said before, I could, when you come to the JTS library, you can see many, many examples of what I just portrayed to you. But here we've got, this is the last example that I'm going to share with you. This is a very interesting manuscript. It actually was produced in Italy in the 15th century, in the mid 15th century. But it was produced by a scribe and artist who identifies himself as being of Ashkenazic origin. He gives us his Hebrew name, and then he tells us that his Yiddish name was Favush Ashkenazi. Right. So, he could go on the Yiddish stage in later generations. I mean, that name was very persistent. I draw your attention here just to the figure who holds the horn and the banner at the bottom right. Right. This is not the kind of illustration, and you'll see this in our next session. This is not the kind of image you would see in a Renaissance Italian manuscript. Right? Renaissance Italy was far brighter and cleaner than what you see here. What you've got is a kind of primitive, a forest, person. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it. Various names have been used here, but look not only at the fur or wool, of his outfit, but the hirsuteness of his face. This is almost a wild man. And elsewhere we do see people we would genuinely interpret as wild men. But what this represents is the spirit of the medieval forest of Ashkenaz. Again, there's nothing whatsoever Jewish about it. This phenomenon will recur over and over, excuse me, and over again. So let me stop sharing and just share with you a final interpretation of this and ask you for your questions or comments. One of the most, to many of us, surprising the first time we see it and powerful things we see in the evidence of the JTS library and its materials is that much of what we've been taught about the separateness of Jews, about Jews feeling different and distant and alienated because they were persecuted, that many of those things are at best half-truths and are often incorrect. Because what we see in the material that actually survives from this time, not what was written about it, but what these Jews actually produced. And if you think about it, outside of Spain, Jews rarely built large buildings that survived through the centuries, right? Very few did, but unlike churches, cathedrals, which did survive unless war or fire got them, Jewish structures didn't survive. So what survived to tell us about the experience of Jews from these centuries? The answer is, more than anything else, the books, the manuscripts. And you can see that evidence. We've got more of that evidence in our collection than anywhere else. And it opens our eyes to an experience of Jewish life, which is often quite surprising and always complicated and interesting. So that's what I've got to say about these examples, but I hope that you have questions and I'd be happy to take them.
In the last page that you showed us, there was a bird at top.
Yes.
I could not tell, is that a dove or was that an eagle or what was that?
What kind of bird was it? Let me get that back here. It's hard to say. It doesn't look like an accurate representation of any particular bird, though if I had to go out on a limb, I would say it's closer to an eagle than anything else.
I thought it was a stork.
Yeah, no, it's not. If you look carefully, it's a very odd bird. These artists didn't always get it right, but it's a good question. It's a good question. I mean, what's fascinating to see, and I often reflect upon this, is, our books might be well produced. They might have careful, small, at best, decorations or fonts and the like. They wanted their books to be beautiful. And they wanted their books to be interesting. And so, if you've got a rabbinic writer who's writing, Talmud or a rabbinic response that only another rabbi is going to read, they just write out the text on the page. But for Jews more generally to use, and particularly those who could afford to have these words to produce the wealthy, they wanted their works to be beautiful. And I promise that this only begins to show the kinds of magnificent decoration that we sometimes see, as we would expect from Renaissance Italy, which is one of the most beautiful, visually beautiful periods in history. The Jewish manuscripts that were produced in that time and place are just astounding, just astounding. Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Please, go ahead.
So the examples you use both in Spain and here in I guess whatever, France, Germany, Jews
Right.
are very much a part of the culture around them, as expressed with the kinds of designs in the book and this and that.
Correct.
And so would you say that for the most part that's the experience of Jews over the centuries, that our vision of people living in shtetls totally separate is more of an anomaly, that over Jewish history, we've more been part of the world around us, and that was
Yes, in terms of the length of Jewish history, right? I'll use your term for a moment, but then I'll revise it. The shtetl is an anomaly. That notion of Jews living on their own, and isolated is an anomaly. Now, what's interesting, what happened in, Central and Eastern Europe is, and primarily to the East in the latter centuries, is that there were so many Jews living together for the first time in many, many centuries of Jewish history, that they could actually create their own society. They had their own local governments, they had their own local courts, obviously schools, all of which allowed them to develop in a language all their own, Yiddish, in more cultural isolation than elsewhere and in the past. But even the shtetl wasn't cut off. I mean, that image of the shtetl is a romantic misrepresentation. I mean, first of all, shtetls were often larger than Fiddler on the Roof, say, would let on. Anatevka is a misrepresentation. But beyond that, and there's a lot of work has happened on this, if you take the tour through these communities in Poland, in Ukraine, in Belarus, and so forth, what you'll find is that Jews constituted somewhere between 40 to 60% of what are rightly called in their day small cities, right? Communities with several thousand people, and Jews lived on one side of town and Christians lived on the other side of town. And they got together in the center of town to trade, to sell their wares, to sell their skills, and so forth. And so, the better part of the representation you find in something like Shalom Aleichem, Tevye the Milkman, and then Fiddler on the Roof is where it shows the interaction and trade between the local Jews and their neighbors. Because while they did have their lives at home that were very much separate, they also had their relations. Okay, it was an excellent question. Anybody else here? Okay, so I don't know if you have some final words, Rabbi, but before you have your final words, what I'm going to say is that I expect you to keep a list of everyone who is here tonight, and I'm hoping that next time you will invite your friends so that we'll get even more people, and I promise what you see there will be exceptionally beautiful and interesting. So we're going to collect all your names, and then when the Rare Book Room reopens, we're going to invite all of you to come and visit us in Morningside Heights of New York City. And I hope I will be able to show you both the things you've seen and many things you haven't seen, and excite you to the legacy of Jewish history that is preserved at JTS. Rabbi.
Thank you so much, Professor Kraemer. And you can see that Rabbi Markowitz did join us as well.
Glad you could, Andy.
Apologies, wedding intake, but thank you so much.
No, listen, it's great to see you.
You too.
So I wanted to thank you once again, and certainly what you just said is what I was going to say, and Brett and I had this conversation in Center City, in Old City, months ago, where we said there's nothing like going and seeing sort of the electric energy of Jewish learning at JTS, and so that is something that we hope to do once again. Historically, we have done it in the past, obviously for good reasons, both pandemic and construction, we have not. But this is as good as we can get right now, and we are grateful for you to come to us in this way. And we do look forward to learning in 2 weeks at this time. And please do tell your friends to join. They will be able to catch up and see new, it's a standalone enough that they'll be able to join in.
What you see next time will, for those of you who have been here, come back, it'll tie into the theme that I've just expressed, but no one will require it. So, people can come in anew without a problem.
Great, and thank you for joining us in this way and sharing these treasures. And really adding to what I think we, specifically as I would say centrist Jews, and find is so important is how do we authentically live in multiple worlds, and how do those worlds intersect and enrich one another. And so this is something I think a lesson that we can take. Look, the Lishma learning of it is worthy in and of itself, but then to take this home and to really feel that and say that maybe we're not the first generation that had to dance at 2 weddings at the same time is
no, not at all. On the contrary,
yeah.
Right? If you'll allow me to say it, Jews have always been inter or multicultural.
Yes, that's very helpful, and I think reassuring to us in this time. Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks, and then may it come speedily in our day up at JTS as well.
Great. We'll see you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.